understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
Buenos dias. I am back in Spain, John, after a brief interlude in Hey on Why the tour is going literally haywire.
I see what you did there.
I went from Bilbao with the pinchos, the tapas, the nice cerveza.
You waddled out of Bilbao.
I waddled out of Bilbao, and I found myself, it was almost like going into a parallel universe in Newport, South Wales last Friday afternoon.
Classy.
Very classy. Newport, South Wales is one of those towns that's really been left behind on many, many indicators. One of the places that's fallen backwards. And also, again, when you go from a town like San Sebastian or Bilbao and you realize that they've got real pride in their municipality, and you end up in the UK where there's no evident pride in the municipality and it's pound shops and it's dereliction, the sort of things we see in Ireland, it just reinforces the idea that what is wrong is governance between the two. And today's podcast is going to be all about Spain, because Spain appears to have got its governance right. The Spanish economy is booming. It has reversed the idea that Spain and the Mediterraneans were slow growing countries in Europe and were attacks on Germany, because in fact, the opposite is the case, number one. It shows you about really interesting civil servants, and when you have good civil servants, and it also shows you how societies do react, though, when they get something like a massive blackout, what the Spaniards had in the last 2 or 3 weeks. So we're going to talk about all that, but I'm now back in Spain because the book is being published under the name Dinero. Surprise, surprise, in Spain. And I'm here to give a speech and meet all sorts of publishers and people in the book trade and all that sort of thing. But I also want to give a shout out to Jack Ryan of Slovakia, a young man who I've just heard this morning has decided to do economics because he is a podcast fan.
Oh, wow. Good man, Jack.
He's an Irish father, Slovakian mother, pursuing economics because of his addiction to our podcast. So thank you very much, Jack, and we will talk to you very soon. Now, just briefly, John, the world before we go to Spain.
Yeah.
We had a climb down for Mr. Trump on European tariffs.
Another taco moment.
Exactly.
Another taco moment.
Always chickens out.
But is he like yet another taco moment? What's that doing to his credibility at this stage?
Look, I think basically most people now realize that there's a playbook, and you just have to, when the missile comes in, you put up the defense system, and then you just wait, and then you realize that the opening gambit is always an opening gambit. It's never a bottom line, and you start again. But there's one headline in the financial press in the last day or two that I find very disturbing, and it's again because I'm doing a lot of interviews on the notion of what is money and where does it come from and can it run out and what are its qualities. And as you know, I've always thought that crypto is something, but it's not money. I see this morning there's just another grift. The Trump media companies, which are the companies of Trump's sons, have raised $3 billion to buy crypto assets, which their own father is pumping up. And it's a massive pump and dump scheme. And this is seriously malignant levels of insider trading are going on right in front of the SEC in the United States.
Yeah, they're not even trying to hide it anymore. This is the bit that really gets me. And the so-called adults in the room are ignoring it as well. Like, the real businessmen, the Lutnicks or the Nutlicks, as you say.
Everyone's in on the grift.
But I just find it really hard to understand that, the rest of the grassroots MAGA, the base, I think is beginning to, question a couple of things here.
Well, basically from the economics perspective, before we talk to Spain, two big things. The biggest worry that I've heard on this tour about money, every time I speak to public audiences, is the dollar in terminal decline? And if the dollar is in terminal decline, what is going to replace it? So is that combination we spoke about the last couple of weeks, very, very high debts, very high debt to GDP ratio, very high levels of interest paying that debt, all creating this vortex of undermining the credibility of the US financial system. The dollar itself is weakening and has weakened dramatically over the last 5 or 6 weeks. No, actually, over the last 8 or 9 weeks. So everyone's talking about, is the dollar in a terminal position or in a position where it's weakening dramatically, right?
Yeah.
At the same time, you have the president pumping crypto, which has been sold by the crypto people as an alternative to the dollar. So not only are the markets worried about the sanctity of the dollar, the security, the safety of the dollar, but you have at the same time, because of an internal personal grift and smash and grab exercise, you have the president boosting the very makey-uppy private currencies who are basing their credibility on the fall of the dollar in the first place. Now that, for Americans, should be much more profoundly disturbing. Why?
Yeah.
Because Americans get paid in dollars. So we will come back to it. I want to talk about Spain, but this, just listeners, just if you want to note something about the global financial markets, what's going on, it's that contrast between the dollar, which is being undermined, and the active undermining of the dollar by the Trump family as they boost their own incomes by grifting crypto. An extraordinary scene. Believe me, this will be looked back on in the future. This will be looked back on in the future as one of those moments where people say, how did we let that happen?
Yeah. So you're back in Spain, Mac?
Yeah, exactly.
Not with your
Blue
pinchos
skies
this
at the
time.
back. Not with pinchos. Blue skies at the back. It's all good.
I could
No,
see
I
it.
tell you,
Beautiful.
I wanted to do something in Spain for a while. 3 reasons, right? First, Spanish growth rates much higher than the rest of Europe. Why is that? It's now being called the miracle economy. Second, Spanish ability to push, drive, and execute infrastructure almost better than everywhere else in Europe. Why is that? Against a background of failure in Ireland and in Britain. I also want to get a handle on what it was like to be in a total blackout of the system. So on the one hand, we're talking Spain is doing well. On the other hand, there's structural problems, most evident by the fact that its electricity grid collapsed.
Yeah.
For 9 hours a couple of weeks ago. And of course, what I want to do is frame the whole thing in the context of what's going on in Europe. Is it the case that the former pigs, which was Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain, are pigs? Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Italy, and Spain
Right.
are now those countries that are doing very well. And the countries that are suffering are the Frances, the Netherlands, the Britons, the Germanys of this world. And what does that all mean? And by the way, I'm giving a talk tomorrow, John, here about Central Europe. So what I might do is our next podcast could well be on what's going on in Central Europe. But
That'd be great. That'd be a really good contrast, actually.
Yeah, exactly. So, but let's go and talk to our resident Spanish expert, Professor Joe Haslam, who teaches in Madrid for all things Spanish. Let's go to Madrid. We are now going down to Madrid to talk to a friend of the show, Professor Joe Haslam of the IE Business School, which is, for entrepreneurship, the #1 business school in Europe. And I have had the pleasure of teaching down there with Joe. Joe, how are you? Great to see you.
Yes, it's good to be back. I think it was 2 years since. So this is sort of a biannual update on how life is in Spain.
Exactly. And what we're doing is, because I'm doing a little bit of a tour, a short tour, touring the book. We're actually we touched on. We didn't even touch on. We did, I think, a very in-depth piece on the Basque Country the other day, John.
Yeah,
which
that was
I
a good
loved.
one. Went down very well.
And now what I want to do is I want to talk about Spain in general and the Spanish economy, the performance of the Spanish economy, which has been pretty spectacular over the last little while, certainly since COVID. But Joe, firstly, one of the things that I think alerted many people to Spain in the last 2 or 3 weeks was the blackout, was the fact that Spain was the country that sort of revealed to us just how fragile our modern economy, and not only economy, our modern society is. What happened? The electricity went off, and how did people react? Tell me exactly what happened.
Yeah, I mean, it was, it's one of those things I've certainly never had. I mean, I teach in the American University in Beirut, so I'm sort of used to blackouts, and I was teaching as it was happening, and you almost assume that it's going to come back on. But of course, I had lots of people in my class from like Argentina and Venezuela, and they were kind of like they sort of autopilot kicked in, and they knew exactly what to do. But I mean, if you had told me getting up that morning that we would be without electricity for 9 hours, I would never have believed it. And you're right, what you say about how dependent we are. I mean, the biggest thing, and this might be relevant to someone who's just written a book about this subject, is nobody had cash, and that was a kind of a huge thing. So you were kind of relying on somebody to say like, "I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today." So you had to kind of literally go into a shop and ask them to, "I'll bring it back to you tomorrow," which I guess is fine in your local corner shop, but the equivalent Carrefour or the equivalent of Tesco are not going to do that. So
But
it
what
was
happened,
it,
Joe? What happened?
well, we don't really know is the sense, which is to say everyone is covering their ass. And what happened in these subjects years ago, I actually did my master's thesis on the whole subject of disaster recovery planning, which,
Nice.
I'm not quite a
It's
prepper,
precisely why
but
you're on this podcast.
so I'm not going to prepper, but I did have like a box with like, sort of 6 liters of water, a torch, a first aid kit, and
And a
like
shotgun.
yeah, yeah.
Exactly. And an
And
axe.
my missus was obviously laughing at me about this, but and then of course when she was on the phone to her friends, she was like, "Oh yeah, Joe knows about these things," this kind of superiority kind of complex. But one of the things that you know about disasters is that unless you clear out the people responsible, you actually can never get to the bottom of the truth because they will always, to try and maintain it wasn't their fault, withhold the information coming forward. So it's a bit like that thing in I often talk about the jury and the untouchables in the movie, where they clear the jury completely because otherwise they don't know who's compromised and who's not. So the person who's head of actually, oddly enough, the electricity grid is privatized. In other words, it's on the stock exchange, which you would have thought, how is a national monopoly on the stock exchange? But that's a question for another day. But it is still majority owned. There's a golden chair. So it is a government appointee. Her name is Beatrice Corredor, a former professor in IE Business School, like a lot of people in this story. And she is in charge of it, but she's kind of holding firm. But her line of defense is a very curious one, which is to sort of say, we can't explain why it happened. However, we can say it will never happen again.
Right.
So, it's a
I
sort
like
of
that
like,
approach. I
yeah.
would that's the sort of thing that I would use in fourth class in national school.
So until that happens, now it's these things
But
often
what did
get.
happen to me? Because I heard, hold on a second, this is a Russian hack. This is, the entire power grid of Spain and much of Portugal goes down straight away. There is no
Well,
backup. There is no sense that the government is in control. People realize, oh my God, our entire life is in the palm of the assumption that electricity will continue to flow. Phones went down, systems went down, everything went down. I
yeah.
mean, what happened? I mean,
Well, the issue is about
you
renewables.
can't just say, "Oh, I'm not too sure." I mean,
Yeah,
this is
yeah.
a big national emergency.
Well, the issue is about renewables and I guess non-renewables or fossil or whatever you want to call them. And Spain is a paradise for renewables. We have sun, we have wind, we have like everything you would need to create renewables. There's a sort of a corridor up near Zaragoza where Amazon are putting in a lot of their wind power, which is basically a tunnel. Basically like the wind blows hard and all of that. So there was always that kind of issue. And the politics of the issue are as follows, which is to say that the two things. First of all, they want to keep the price of electricity low. And is because wages are low, because productivity are low. So the people don't have the money to pay these huge electricity bills. So the politics of it was to try and keep the price of electricity low.
Okay.
This gets into our wider argument about what it's like to live in a socialist economy versus what it's like to live in a non-interventionist. So, when the kind of pandemic hit, they reduced the price of public transport, they reduced the price of electricity, they reduced the price of gas. It was a sort of a concentrated government effort to reduce the price of all of these things. So the grid, which was designed in a pre-renewables age, in other words, it was designed not to have this renewables, They were playing with it in order to, to get energy from one source and then another and all of that. And I guess they just cut a bit too close to the wind and they expected to go to a source of renewable energy. And when they went to it, it wasn't there. And that's what took
Okay.
down the grid.
So this could happen in any country.
Well,
Because most countries are making this transition. Most of the grids now are, there's a bit stuck on here and there's a bit stuck on there. The original grid, as you said, is a fossil fuel grid, but we're trying to encourage people, either even domestically, personally, as well as on a corporate level, to have new source of energy. So are you saying that what happened in Spain could happen anywhere?
yeah, I mean, they should never go that close to the wind, to mix my metaphors. I mean, you should never have any possibility where this could go. But, you do have making money, in other words, the energy companies. And that's why the government is blaming the energy companies for basically because the price you pay for energy is different depending on whether it's renewable or non-renewable source. Only about like 30% of the electricity bill in Spain is actually, product you consume. The rest of it is just all sorts of subsidies and all sorts. It's a sort of a sleeping target for if you need a few quid to kind of like for some pet project somewhere, you add this on. So the issue is that, which is that it's possible to design a grid that is, works perfectly with renewables, but it's not the grid we have now. And that's kind of the issue. And the energy companies, in a way, it sort of suits them because they can, in renewables, obviously input costs are almost zero. So they make a lot more money if renewables can go in. So that's where you have the standoff. But,
Okay.
and Pedro Sanchez says this is really the focus on renewables because, of course, Vox, the hard right, flat earth, kind of God-fearing right wing, they always say, like,
You
this
don't
is
like them, I
God.
take it.
Yes. Well, this is God's way of telling us not to have renewables, And yeah, I mean, they're, fantastically entertaining bunch of people. I mean, no, we should take the far right seriously, but that's kind of the issue. So they're tied in with this whole, there's some of this going on all over Europe. The Dutch are also saying like the climate transition just hurts the poor rural God-fearing folk. But
Oh,
that's
I think the right wing versus net zero is a big, big political debate. And I think it's actually something that is gaining more currency in more and more countries,
yeah,
from the United States to the UK to now Spain, everywhere, is that basically net zero is a sort of a woke
yeah.
target that is being created to cripple the working man through high energy prices.
Yeah. The final thing then is it's a nuclear issue, which is to say that Spain wants to turn off its nuclear power because, nuclear is like The Simpsons and Two Mile Island and all of that. And the companies who run these stations are saying that, like, there's plenty of life left in these stations. Nuclear is a non-carbon fuel. You can turn it on when you need the base load, and that nuclear is perfectly compatible with renewables. So if you have a grid that has renewables and nuclear, then you don't need fossil fuels. But the socialist governments have taken again the nuclear industry. So that's another issue. So you have the renewables, you have the fossil, and you have the nuclear, and they're all kind of blaming each other, really.
Can I ask you just one other thing on this before we go into the economy, right? The last couple of weeks, I've been watching this Argentinian Netflix series called Eternauta, which is, well, it's because Martin Lustau's wife, Carla Peterson, is in it. Martin asked
Okay.
me, okay.
Okay.
The things I watch, John, the things I watch. Eternauta, John, is about it's a crazy sci-fi thing, but there's one moment where the electricity grid is hacked by aliens. So you'd love this sort of stuff, John. But the point is that it's all about how humans react in adversity, right?
Yeah.
It's not all about, but that's one of the themes, is how do humans react in adversity? And of course, the sort of the typical sci-fi Hollywood TV producer attitude is we go mad, we go crazy, right? And we turn on each other very, very quickly. It's like Mad Max or something. But in Spain, that didn't happen.
Yeah, that was super fascinating. And actually, there's an economic angle to it as well, which is that, a lot of people say, particularly people in civil service jobs or people who don't live in this kind of you have to make targets kind of a world. For them, they just kind of like, oh, okay, we can leave the office, And then they just kind of sat in one of those. There's a plaza in Madrid that Simon Cooper revealed in the FT, and he turned it from a lovely community place to the place where every kind of visitor to Madrid now turns up in. He sort of destroyed the neighborhood by revealing the secret. But they were kind of sitting around in the sun drinking beer and having a great time. But people who were actually had real jobs. Like we have a bar up in Galicia. I bought the bar in Galicia in my wife's village to sort of prevent an outside takeover. She came home, she was sad one day and said, the bar is for sale. It could be taken over by, some kind of chain. So I
This
ended up
sounds like a Western. This is great.
I-
This sounds like a John Ford Western. Irishman comes in, buys the bar from Nasty. Tell me the
Well,
story.
well, there's a sort of a joke which says that I ended up buying the bar to get a summer job for my daughter, but I was chatting away to the guy. I was chatting away to the guy trying to be kind of nice to him, and then he said, "Oh, what do you do?" "I'm professor of entrepreneurship and, that kind of thing." And then he kind of mentioned something that he is thinking of selling, I was like, "Okay, right." And then I kind of like went home to the missus. And of course, the way things work there, he couldn't sell to me because it would be a shame to sell to a foreigner,
Oh
but he could
yeah,
sell to
absolutely.
her because, she's from the village. So we had, of course, like about 10,000 worth of stock in the freezers and, ice cream and food, like, which is all lost, so we're have to discuss an insurance claim about that. But, so people in the real economy who were doing real things were affected. Similarly, I had an event booked that night with the speaker that I had paid a lot of money to bring in, and that event couldn't go ahead. So I had to pay for her to come, but then she couldn't give the speech, so I had to give the money back. So, I lost, several thousand euros, but that's because my job is a sort of, I'm a person who's creating things. But if you're a civil servant or somebody who's not, then it was just like, as they say here, no
It's a
pasa
day
nada.
off.
Day
It's a
off,
day off. It's a day off.
So,
Exactly.
and it was said, in the opinion columnists were sort of revealing that what it showed about Spain was like how many people are sort of detached from the productive economy. And there's this really scary statistic which Spain breached and also Ireland breached, and actually even the USA are in danger of breaching. Whereas, which is to say that the public service becomes larger than the private sector, because once it goes over 50, it gets to 60 before it goes to 40. And that's a problem that Spain has hit, which is to say that there is more, if you look at the national income, when the public sector is larger than the private sector, that's a really worrying sign because, of course, productivity comes largely from the private sector.
So now that flies in the face of everything I'm hearing about Spain, the miracle economy, the economy that's rebounded from COVID better than any other. Tell me about that and tell me how consistent that is with this suggestion that there is an energetic private sector which is hamstrung by this lugubrious public sector. Because what I'm looking at, the top line data says, look, Spain's doing really, really very, very well.
Yeah, I mean, this is fascinating both from a sort of economic point of view, but also from the like a political, the people involved. So, I mean, there are three reasons why Spain is low. The Economist says it's the best performing in the world. The FT also had to kind of reluctantly come out and say this higher growth than the US. And there's sort of three reasons for it. One is immigration, which is to say, that when the left gets in power, as it is in Colombia and other countries, a lot of people come to Spain, and these are like well-educated, productive people. So nearly 1 million of them have come. About 900,000 of them go straight into paid working employment. Which is
And they're mainly from
fantastic.
Latin America, the immigrants, are they?
Yeah, mainly from Latin America. I mean, Latin America is of course enormous, and the movement of it. So those people, in many cases, their grandparents left kind of the hunger in Spain in the 1960s and 70s and went to Venezuela or whatever. But also Spain has an enormously generous. I don't know of any other country in the world that has a generous immigration regime, which is to say that if you come from what's called a former colony. I mean, there's probably a nicer word for this, but that you can basically, if you come to Spain and you work for 2 years, you can get a passport. And, that is incredibly generous. I mean, even the Philippines, so technically anyone from the Philippines can come to Spain if they get an offer of a contract. So they get their work permit. And if they stay for 2 years, then they get a Spanish passport, which is enormously generous. And it's, to get a European passport is, of course, a huge thing. So we get a lot of people who, when the economy goes down or the left gets into power, they say to themselves, like, why wouldn't I go to Spain? Like
Yeah.
work there and then get a European passport, and maybe then things turn in the other direction. So we've had a lot of those people, and then there's this sort of what's called the Madrid-Miami effect, where a lot of wealthy Latin Americans, and it's not just wealthy. I mean, that would be wrong. Like people come and work as waitresses and waiters as well. and those people are in real employment. But a lot of the kind of the effect in terms of the productivity comes from wealthy, well-educated Latin Americans who choose to come to Madrid rather than Miami. This is sort of the other two. So that's number one, right? And
Yeah.
then the second thing is tourism. And in particular, like global warming has had an interesting effect, which is to say that the north of Spain, which I guess now that I'm a bar owner, I want to try and promote, was sort of, neglected. But because of the global warming, a lot of people are starting to look much more at the north of Spain, including places like Bilbao and San Sebastian and Asturias and all along there, Galicia. So Spain is able to absorb more tourism, and tourism numbers. France doesn't have a good publicity in terms of like Le Pen and stuff. And the US obviously has Trump. So that's kind of sending people to Spain. So Spain has benefited from more tourism, which is, of course, as they call it, it's like an export essentially in terms of money. And then the final thing is pandemic payments. Like we really got our act together in terms of Europe. A thing that Ireland used to be before, of course, we got notions. Ireland used to be very good at looking at Europe as like a source of cash. You remember the Albert
Absolutely.
Reynolds
It was an
standing with the
ATM. It was a multilingual ATM.
and now, of course, we're too cool for that. Plus, of course, our numbers, our leprechaun economy means that we can't argue that we deserve to get money. But Spain kind of, as it tends to do in this situation, got the documents in and argued that they needed to get a lot of money. So, I got a free laptop out of it. I got like insulation for the home, all sorts of sort of stuff,
You bought a bar.
Yeah.
It's all going on.
Well, I like it's funny how, ways in which in my 20s, I was like, private sector, never want to deal with the government for anything. And then you're like, would you like a laptop? And you're like, well, okay, yeah, why not?
Yeah.
And it's all European social funds or
Particularly if some German dude pays for it. It's all even better.
digitalization or something like that. So I like that was the thing. So Spain really got its act together in terms of, whatever is coming from Brussels, we're well in there. So those three things is basically what has increased our growth rate. But then if not our productivity, which is, that's a much more interesting. It's not house prices that matter. It's wages and productivity that matters. And Spain's story there isn't going in the right direction.
And just on the issue of house prices, this is something that every now and then sparks up in the news. For example, I'm in Barcelona. There was a lot of anti-tourist feeling because there was a feeling that the tourists were pushing up the prices, Airbnbs, they were elbowing out short-term rents. Also, the sort of digital nomads, some of these people from Latin America are also people from the north coming down and working for a little while. What's the source and what's the sense now of the housing market in Spain? Because obviously the image you've picked of like, 1 million new immigrants from Latin America, etc. All this is all going to push up prices.
Yeah, but Spain is just such a big country. The thing about Ireland, it's just so small. There's probably
Yes.
a nicer way to say about that. But going back to Basil Chubb's book, "The Government and Politics of Ireland," in the that we started in university, he keeps on saying that we're subscale. That whereas Spain is not subscale. It's an enormous country. And Poland is also benefiting from this factor. So the housing thing. You can still buy like a 3-bedroom apartment in the poshest part of Madrid for like $500,000. I saw a house in Drimnagh in the Irish Times for like $500,000. And I'm thinking like, this has to be kind of something going wrong here,
No, there are many things going wrong. There are
Yes,
many things
indeed.
going wrong. There's a list.
So that's the kind of the issue. So like it's coming from a very low base because Spain, when it was a centrally planned economy for like 40 odd years, the feeling was if everyone had a house, no one would look for like rights and social. So Spain is kind of very centrally planned in terms of having all of these kind of like 6-story high blocks and with nice apartments and things like that. So it's coming from a very low base. So when they talk about house prices, sometimes you kind of go like, well, I'll tell you about Ireland. But what is happening is that, Pedro Sánchez gets a lot of credit for, he has done it for a socialist, which we often associate with incompetence. He has done a lot of things well and he has very good people around him. But he's really the one issue that he's vulnerable in is housing because he's not serious about tackling it. his voting base, a lot of them, with a bit of extra money, what people generally do, they don't invest it in the stock market or the Magnificent Seven or QQQ or anything. What they do is that they buy a buy-to-let. So you have a lot of those kind of people, and those people are voters and they do not want to be disturbed. So Pedro Sanchez picks on Airbnb, which is like at maximum like 1 or 2% of the total problem. So, Pedro is kind of talking about taxing foreign people buying second homes. He's going after Airbnb. He's talking a good game, but realistically, he's not tackling the issue in terms of bringing houses down so that they're affordable for people who didn't get on the property ladder or in their 20s, and that's pretty serious.
Just before you go to restack the bar and have a couple of very chilled, cold beers, can I ask you finally about Spanish infrastructure? Because one thing that strikes anybody who's been here over, let's say, a period of 20 years is that Spain seems to have invested very, very efficiently in public transport infrastructure, particularly rail networks, metro networks. We did a podcast a while back which showed that the Spanish and the Italians, but particularly the Spanish, are by far and away the most productive and the most efficient builders of trains, metros, etc. Does that suggest that there is within the state a deep competence for
Yeah.
engineering that doesn't exist in other countries? And why is that?
Well, the first thing is, we have the Irish mammy likes to be a doctor or a lawyer, but the Spanish mammy likes their little Jose or Maria to become an engineer. It's sort of seen as being a builder, and so engineering is regarded as a kind of help my son the engineer is drowning kind of stuff. But they
Spoken like a
so
true Corkman.
Yes, indeed. So that's the first thing. There's a lot of respect for engineering. And you find, there's like 4 huge construction companies, one of which is famously run by Florentino Perez, who build all over the world. So, Spain are big builders. It's a sort of a big thing. The second thing, of course, is that the government have people within Madrid, for instance, has a whole department of people. They don't have to like put these things out for tender and get consultants involved. And as I understand it in Ireland, it's because, there's 20%, 20%, 20%, subcontracting, all of this kind of stuff. No,
Yeah.
there's a civil servant effectively who's head of building this thing. The other thing, of course, is that always a good day to damn the Brits for everything that goes wrong. But, they left us with their planning, their attitude towards planning, which is a sort of, that's not true in Spain at all. You can build underneath someone's house to your heart's content, whereas in Ireland, you sort of own underneath your house and these kind of things. And it's a really interesting thing as well about who goes into the public service. There is a competitive exam, oposiciones, and you have these things called abogados de Estado, which again, you have the Spanish mammy, my son, the abogado de Estado. They like identify like the best people. And it was something that we used to do years ago with the scholarship boys, these guys, O'Cromeen and Gallagher, all these. I mean, how do I know the names of these people? And they were like the best people ended up being like Secretary General of the civil servants. And in Spain, you still come across these people. I go to like breakfasts for the free orange juice and croissants in the Ritz, where all of these people talk about important policy matters, and they're very, very serious. You have a good night,
And they're taken seriously as well.
Yes, they're taken very seriously. And I mean, again, in IE Business School, there's a sort of like, if you write something interesting, you're pulled into the government and you're kind of, so the 2 principal advisors for Pedro Sanchez are both former IE professors who were kind of like tapped on the shoulder and said, your country needs you. So it ends up I have to teach double amount of classes.
Whereas in Ireland, if you write something interesting, you're automatically the enemy of the public service.
Yeah,
Take you out and shoot you.
it is an interesting question, but they like, there's real elites in Spain, and an elite is somebody who has gone to Harvard or Stanford or Oxford or the Sorbonne or something like that. And they have been kind of, a lot of them are aristocratic and, they're taken very seriously. And I mean, the thing I love about living in Spain is that I'm taken incredibly seriously. You stand up in Ireland and you say, go on out the yard. I mean, I make speeches, or I write an article in El País, and I suddenly I'm taken like enormously seriously, to the point where I'm kind of thinking like, crikey, am I kind of Saudi Arabia? But when you're taken seriously, it's incredibly compulsive. You like to be, once it happened once, you like to be continue to do it. And that's the thing. People who talk about serious matters are taken seriously.
The amazing thing in Ireland is the opposite of the case. If you write something serious that challenges the status quo, your ideas go through three phases. The first phase is the open ridicule phase, where you're kind of laughed at in public. And the second phase is the kind of violent opposition phase, where the government can count on journalists to do a hit job on you. And then the third phase is the phase we always get to, which is the phase we are now, which is everybody pretends they were on your side all the time phase. And that's basically how Ireland works. Whereas, and the question is, why should it be?
Yeah.
But I do take your point that basically, so we're going back to close, and it's a discussion or a debate between Napoleon and the Duke of Wellington, because Napoleon was the guy who came up and said, look, we need centralized civil servants, haute calls in France, people to run the place efficiently. The Duke of Wellington, after Waterloo, was like, don't worry, we'll take the British approach. It'll be all fine with common law, etc., etc. And when you're saying these are such structurally fundamental differences that they have massive, not intergenerational, but intercentury ramifications.
Yeah. And it's now, I mean, the in terms of the civil servant, that part is going well. I mean, the final issue, which is to say that you have these kind of in between the two. So you have large companies like Telefonica, like the electricity grid, Indra, and these companies that are basically, you don't know where the government ends and the private sector begins. And what Pedro Sánchez has done is that he has taken out the CEO, and he's put in somebody who's more aligned to the party. And that's happened in Telefonica, that's happened with the Airports Authority, that's happened with the electricity. And, that's a kind of, from an institutional point of view, I mean, the why nations fail theory is that the institutions must remain independent. And now he has put someone into the Banco de Spain, which is also...
This is the last couple of months, is it?
Yes, because they're in Spain. The media and I guess you could say the judiciary are to the right of the center, and the onslaught of Pedro. They've accused his wife of things. They've accused his brother because they can't get him. I mean, the personalities of it is the right hate Pedro Sánchez because he's tall and confident and good looking.
He's very good looking. He's also called the handsome one, isn't he?
Yes, El Guapo.
Trump,
yeah.
Trump would love him. Trump loves. He's a very handsome guy. I could deal with him.
There's a meme of Ursula von der Leyen looking like kind of lustfully at him. That and they hate that because on the right, they basically, for various corruption scandals and other reasons, had to clear out a whole layer of the party. So the next layer that came along are kind of second rate. And they can't really lay a glove on this guy. It's one thing to be a sort of a socialist, but he's multilingual, and so they can't get him directly. So they go after his wife, they go after his brother, and for things that they may have cut a few corners, but the amounts of money involved are trivial. And if they weren't related, then no one would care. So what basically happens then is, because they can't get him, they go at that. So Pedro's response is then to try and take over the institutions. And that's not going to end in a good place. So, the story for Spain is very good in terms of our headline numbers. But the story, in the medium term is we need to get back to independent institutions, and we need the private sector to regenerate itself, and that the best people... Basically, we need these great companies like Mango and Inditex and all of these fantastic companies. And I don't see a lot of those on the horizon. And that is eventually going to be a problem.
Joe Haslam, as always, I think a podcast from a remote bar in Galicia in the middle of the sweltering Spanish summer
sounding good.
Would be absolutely brilliant.
Fantastic. I have a little cabinet in there for my locals that has a bottle of whiskey, and what I do is I print people's name on it. And for the local officials, they can come in, and then they have a key, and they can open the thing, take out their whiskey, and then drink it. So that's the way you look after the locals.
What I love is corruption comes in many forms, in many guises. Joe, listen, that was great stuff. We'll talk to you soon. See ya.
Fantastic. Thanks,
Emil.
David. Good to see you again.
El Guapo, Mark, El Guapo. That's yourself.
If you could see me now, you wouldn't do
Yes.
that.
El Guapo with a fop. Come here. So let's go back on this. You know, that covered so much ground, which is brilliant. It gives
Yes,
a really
it did,
good
yeah.
view of Spain. But the housing thing really grabbed my attention there. What was this thing about Napoleon and, you know, the
Well, you know
Duke of
what, I like-
Wellington and its effects on housing?
Exactly. Well, I always like to think that, you know, economics is a long, long story, intergenerational, but as I was saying, they're inter-century thing. No, the reason I talk about Napoleon, so the Battle of Waterloo, John, in a nondescript place in Belgium, pitted the forces of Napoleonic France and Revolution Europe against monarchist Europe and basically the France of modernity and liberalism against tradition, right? And tradition won, not necessarily because the Duke of Wellington won, but because the Prussians came in and helped him. And why? Because the Prussians themselves were anti-French. So the French were this coalition against the world. But one of the fascinating things about revolutionary France, and it extended to Spain, was that they gave a system of law called the Napoleonic Code to lots of Latin Europe. And the Napoleonic Code is based on the primacy of the state rather than the primacy of the citizen. So what it says is the citizen is part of the state, and therefore the state represents the citizen. And the contrast to that is the common law of the British legal system, which we have in Ireland, Britain, Canada, Australia, United States, all of which places we're having problems with the housing market, is where the individual has the right to actually take the state to court over what they would call the primacy of individual rights. Now, what happens in that case is that when you're building houses or you're building infrastructure, there is no real sense of the common good because the individual can always stop it. And that's what Joe was saying. And so this is a legacy. This is a legacy. So the reason the Spaniards can build great trains and great metros isn't only that they have engineering capacity in the state. It isn't only that they have this state system which gets great graduates from great universities and gives them prestigious jobs in the public sector, but it's also the fact that the entire muscularity of the state is set for what they call the common good, which means a certain amount of conformity all the time. There are more Spaniards in apartments than in any other country in the world.
Yeah.
They're the highest proportion of apartment living. Their cities are incredibly well planned. You look here in Barcelona, many people who are into urban planning would say Barcelona is probably the exemplar of how to build a reasonably medium-rised, attractive city where rents were low for quite some time, etc.
The aerial view of Barcelona, it's like a honeycomb.
Yeah, it's an amazing grid.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah. So we will leave it here that one of the lessons from Spain is that the way in which you set your government up counts and counts materially. And if you want to get things done, it's far more efficient to be the inheritor of Napoleon than the inheritor of the Duke of Wellington, who we know was brought up in Merrion Square, John.
Yes.
And if Ireland wants to get its act together, we need a massive root and branch change the way we do governance. And if we don't get that, we will just limp from crisis to crisis.
Yeah.
Talk to you on Tuesday.